Okay, so after completing the musculature of the mink, we're going to move inside and look at some of the internal organs. This will begin in the thorax and the abdomen. And so those are two terms that you've probably heard of before, but just to be sure you know what we're talking about here, the thorax is your chest. So basically, in you, it's kind of like from the bottom of your ribs up. And the abdomen is your gut or your belly. And so technically, these two things are separated by the diaphragm, which we'll look at when we talk about the respiratory system. Again, sticking mostly to anatomy here. We'll learn a little bit about function, but not too much. And I think this is my favorite of the photoshopped pictures in this whole slideshow. Now, the digestive system, we're going to follow the digestive tract. So we're going to start where food would start, which is your mouth, and then go all the way through. So the mouth and tongue is your oral cavity, and inside that oral cavity you've got two palates that we talk about. The palates are the tissue that separate the oral cavity from the nasal cavity above it in your head. And you've got a hard palate, which is located more anterior, so more toward the front of your mouth, and you've got a soft palate that's located more posteriorly, so toward the back of your mouth. So not that you need to stick your finger in your mouth, but if you want to use your tongue or something, you can feel that the front part of the roof of your mouth is harder, it's bony, and that's why it's called a hard palate. But as you move back, you'll eventually get to a part that's softer, and that's where the bone stops, but you still have a soft tissue separation between your nasal cavity and your throat. Now, also, in that oral cavity, you have teeth, and just like us, mink have 4 different types of teeth. The first ones are called the incisors, and these are going to be your front teeth, right? They're thin, they're sharp, and they're primarily for cutting of tissues that you're eating. The canine teeth are going to be most accentuated in a mink because they are carnivores. Again, these are the most effective for hunting animals. Canines are also sometimes called cuspids, and they are the sharp, single-pointed teeth that you use for poking and tearing. And so human cuspids are not real well drawn here in this picture, but they're actually pretty sharp too, right? Those are your vampire teeth. Behind your canines or your cuspids, you have what are called premolars or bicuspids. If you feel these teeth in yourself, these are a little bit flatter, but they still kind of have peaks to them, and they really kind of have 2 peaks to them, or 2 points. That's why I call them bicuspids. But these are a little bit flatter. They're still going to tear a little bit, but they're mainly going to be used for crushing. And then your back teeth, as we call them, are your molars, and these are flat and kind of bumpy, and you're going to use these for chewing and grinding up your foods. Now, once you move through that oral cavity, you are going to travel down the long, soft, smooth muscular tube called the esophagus. And this tube is just there to carry food on from the mouth to the stomach. This is a muscular tube. It's usually pinched closed in you, except for when you move food down through it. So food will kind of squeeze its way down your esophagus, but otherwise that tube stays closed so that things don't come back up, right, from your stomach. Now that takes us to the stomach. The mink stomach is going to be a little bit differently shaped. It's not exactly like these pictures, which are more human, but it is broken up into similar regions. You may not have known that your stomach is actually a series of locations, basically, within the sac. The very first part of the stomach is called the cardiac region, or the cardia. This is the cardiac stomach where food enters. Then you've got sort of a bulge off here to the left, and that's called the fundus, or the fundic region of the stomach. Then the majority of your stomach is known as the body, and that's just basically kind of like a big bag. And then the very last portion is called your pyloric stomach, or your pylorus. Now, the only other thing that you want to recognize in the stomach is that it should have 2 sides to it basically, and we identify these with a name because in a human, if these are kind of messed up, sometimes that will affect your digestive system. So the outer, larger and convex curve of the stomach is called the greater curvature, while the inner, smaller concave curvature of the stomach is called the lesser curvature. Now, the overall function of the stomach is to store foods after you eat them and to start beginning the digestive process. As you guys know, I think already, the stomach is very acidic, and this is helpful both in breaking down foods but also in protecting you from things that might get into your stomach. So if you swallow bacteria and things like you do every time you eat, they'll a lot of times be killed by that acidity. You also have what I like to call control valves, and these are called sphincters, technically, is the term, that are at either end of the stomach. So you have a sphincter up here called the esophageal sphincter, and you have a sphincter down here called the pyloric sphincter. And these open and close, and this allows you to bring stuff into the stomach or let stuff out of the stomach, but also control and keep the acid inside there as best you can. Acid going to the small intestine, the next step, is not so bad. Acid moving back into the esophagus, as you guys might know, is not good. And we call that acid reflux, and that can be a very uncomfortable condition, causes heartburn, and can be damaging to your esophagus. So we want the sphincter there to keep that from happening. After the stomach, we move to the intestines. The small intestine comes first, and the small intestine has three portions to it. It has the duodenum, which is just the very first part. It has the jejunum, which is sort of all here in the middle, and then it has the ileum, which is the very end part of it. The function of the intestine is to continue digestion and then absorb. In fact, this is the bigger thing, right? The intestine is where you're going to absorb the nutrients that you eat and get those into your bloodstream and get them out to your cell. Or cells, all of them. Now, the longest part of your digestive tract is your small intestine, which seems funny, I know, by the name. But when we say small intestine, what we mean there is that it's a pretty narrow tube. It is actually a really long tube. In a human, obviously it's all folded up, but you have roughly 21 feet of small intestine inside your abdomen, so it's really well folded up inside of there. And in the mink, I think the small intestine is probably about 6 or 7 feet long, roughly. So probably longer than the table you're working on in class. The small intestine is held together by a little double membrane called the mesentery. That's extraordinarily hard for me to explain, but when we see it in the lab, you'll know exactly what we mean. So we'll take a look at that membrane when we have our mink opened up. After the small intestine comes a large intestine. It is much shorter than the small intestine, but it has a larger diameter, so it's a wider tube, and that's why we call it the large intestine. Now, in humans, it has this particular shape that you see on the right here. Stuff from the small intestine enters the large intestine, it moves up, it loops across, it moves back down, and then out. You do not see this characteristic loop shape in the mink. The large intestine, you'll be able to tell where the intestine gets wider or gets larger, but it's also just kind of wadded up in here like the small intestine is. The function for the large intestine, or sometimes called the colon, is to absorb more nutrients, but also to prepare your waste. So you're going to start actually secreting some liquids here too, and you're going to continue forming your excrement, your feces. Then you've got the rectum, which is sort of the muscular end point of the large intestine, where you would store your feces until you're ready to go to the bathroom, and then that will exit via the anus. And both of these are very muscular, so you can actually control that function usually. Now, also, as you're dissecting, don't forget the anal scent glands are down there, so do be careful what you're cutting into so that you don't get a really stinky mess on your hands. Now, the digestive system also has some of what we call accessory organs, which are not tubes for food to pass through, which is what we've seen so far, but rather they just help you digest. So that's what we call them, accessory. The first one of these is the pancreas. Pancreas rests on the stomach and duodenum, as you see right here, and it really has two different parts. we learned about one part in the first semester, and that was the endocrine pancreas. So this is what secretes insulin and glucagon, helps you with your blood sugar regulation. We don't really worry about that so much now with the mink, but we're more interested in the exocrine pancreas. Exocrine meaning it secretes things that will go out of the body. This is going to secrete digestive enzymes into your small intestine, and they will do so via this pancreatic duct and this common bile duct, which then exit here into the small intestine so that those digestive enzymes can travel in the small intestine and help break down the foods that you eat. Pancreas can be kind of hard to find in the mink, so we'll work on that one together. The largest, really the largest internal organ that you have and the largest of the accessory organs is the liver. This is a very large, very dense, solid organ found in the upper or anterior abdomen. It's going to go right up against your diaphragm, so it's kind of right at the top of your abdomen. The liver has tons of functions in the human. Again, since that's not really our focus, we're just worried about it in terms of its digestive work. And in digestion, the liver forms what's called bile. And this is sort of a yellowish, greenish colored liquid that is full of enzymes that help you digest certain foods, especially fats. So the liver is very important in digesting fats. The pancreas helps you digest carbohydrates and proteins a little bit more. Now, right along with the liver, you have the gallbladder, which is a little bag that's kind of tucked right up underneath the liver. It is generally green in color. It's stained by the bile that it stores. And really what's going on here is the liver makes bile all the time, but you don't really need bile all the time. You only need it when you eat. So as it makes bile, it will store it in the gallbladder, and then when you eat, that will trigger release by the gallbladder, and it will send bile into your intestines. This moves by the cystic duct and then also the common bile duct. So if you notice on the last slide, the pancreas and the gallbladder both secrete things through the same duct called the common bile duct, and then that'll go into the small intestine. So that takes care of the digestive system, but while we're looking in the abdomen, we also need to consider the urogenital system, which would have two parts to it, a urinary system that you use to excrete liquid wastes, and your reproductive system. Now, your mink on your table will be male or female, so you won't see all of these parts necessarily, but you should kind of generally know both systems as they are presented here in your notes and in your lab handbook. I would encourage you, if one of the other groups in class has a different sex, so if your mink is male and theirs is female, maybe take a look at theirs at the end of dissection and check out what those female parts look like as well, or vice versa. So starting with the urinary system as part of the urogenital system, you've got two kidneys, and these will be pictured on the next slide here. You got two kidneys. These are up against your back. So these are on the dorsal wall of the abdominal cavity, under your ribs. These kidneys are what make urine, and they do so by filtering your bloodstream. So they filter waste out of your blood flow along with some liquids and create urine. Urine then travels from the kidneys through a tube called the ureters, or ureter, which goes from the kidney to the urinary bladder. It's stored in the urinary bladder until it fills to a certain point that you feel uncomfortable, right? And then you have to pee, right? And so then you will release that urine through the urethra. Notice it sounds a lot like ureter, but this time it's urethra, which is the tube that exits the bladder and then exits your body, and that tube is going to run through the penis in a male or the vagina in a female. Picture of that. So you got a kidney on either side. Those are going to be really easy to find. They're up against that back wall. These are actually encased in fat, which helps protect them, but it means you're going to have to clear a lot of that out here in the lab. Lots of blood vessels and stuff coming in and out here too. We'll find those later. But then the ureter are these tubes, one from each of the kidneys, that run down here into the urinary bladder. We want to be specific here. And from the urinary bladder, again, once it fills up enough to where you start to feel that stretching in your body, you can release through your urethra. Now, in terms of the reproductive system, I've got a slide with the words for both of them and then a picture of both. The male reproductive system, we're going to learn these both very simply. consists of testicles, or sometimes called testes. These are found between the hind legs in all the males of the mammalian group. And these testicles produce sperm, which is your male gamete that we talked about way back when we did meiosis. Leaving the testicle, you've got a spermatic cord, which is really a bundle of tubes that leave the testicle, and that's going to include some blood vessels, some nerves, and then a tube called the vas deferens. And the vas deferens is the tube within that spermatic cord that carries the actual sperm from the testes, will join with the urethra and exit via the penis, just like urine can get out from the urinary system. Females are a little bit different, but all in all, it's a very similar system. Rather than testicles, they have ovaries. These are found posterior to the kidney, so a little further down the back than the kidneys, but against that dorsal body wall, and this is where you produce eggs, or the female gametes. Ovaries are really small in mink, and so you're probably going to struggle to find these if you have a female mink. Leaving the ovaries is a tube called an oviduct, again, very tiny and hard to find, which connect the ovary and can carry an egg to the uterus. Now, really important here, the uterus is different in a mink than it is in a human. Otherwise, all this stuff is pretty much the same, but the uterus for any kind of mammal is a larger organ where a fertilized egg can implant and your new offspring will develop. So the human uterus is where a new baby develops. In a human, this is basically just like a large open structure where you would imagine a baby would be able to develop. In a mink, it's really important, this uterus has a strange shape, and we call it bicornate. What this means is it has two horns. So whereas in a human, you got these tubes that come down, and then there's a sort of a large, well, there's an opening there, a large uterus like this. In the mink, we don't see that. In the mink, it's basically like these two tubes that join together and then become one tube. But that would be the uterus, and it just kind of has two sides to it, or two horns to it, as we call it. And that's the major difference between a human female reproductive system and a mink one. Then at the lower area, posterior area of the uterus, you will find the cervix. This is where those uterine horns come together, and then that opens up into the vagina, or the vaginal opening. Make sure just to wrap that up with the important reproductive parts highlighted here for you. For the male, you've got testes or testicles. Those are going to give up a spermatic cord, which will contain the vas deferens. So here's a whole spermatic cord, and it's kind of cut away on this side to show you just the vas deferens. Those tubes come around, join the urethra basically, and can exit then via the penis, which will be easy to find if you have a male. For women, or for female mink, you've got the ovaries again, which are very small, but against this back wall. The oviduct leaves that, becomes a uterus. Again, this two-horned or bicornuate uterus that we see in a female. And then there's a cervix at the bottom of the uterus, and then that becomes your vaginal area that opens out there. Also, you can see on this page a pretty good picture of the urinary system of the actual mink, and these are the pictures that appear in your mink handbook. For that urinary system, notice again that you've got your kidneys up here on the body wall. The ureters come down, and this is a weird looking picture here, but when you have your mink open, you'll notice that this really is what the urinary bladder looks like. In a mink, it's not going to be full, so it's not going to be stretched out. It's going to be this little small, dense organ, it's really not hard to find in there. And then from the bladder, you can exit again via the urethra in either of these cases. Okay, so that takes care of the digestive system and the urogenital system, which will be the next part of our dissection.